Hi everyone, this is Hannah Coakley, registered dietitian nutritionist, host of Put Your Food Where Your Mouth Is. You might have noticed that today we didn't start with a funny little intro or catchy jingle. That's mostly to do with the fact that what I want to talk about today in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many, many others, and the current protests throughout the country in support of Black Lives Matter. I didn't think that what I want to talk about today should be presented in a joking manner. Today, I'd like to talk very briefly on the intersection of race, politics, and nutrition. And I want to start by acknowledging that what I am able to address and disseminate is based off the work of researchers, grassroots organizers, academics who are primarily people of color. The first thing I want to touch on very briefly is food access. So there's two things to think about in food access. One is, why is produce so expensive? And two is, why aren't there grocery stores where grocery stores are needed? So to touch on the grocery store aspect, I think a lot of this has to do with biases in terms of placing any type of store in a low-income neighborhood or in a rural community. So there is a belief in kind of a larger corporate structure that those types of stores may not be economically viable, let's say. And because, unfortunately, we do have most of our grocery stores running on a corporate structure, you aren't seeing large mom and pop grocery stores that are making produce readily available. And so I just want to take a brief moment to explain that a huge reason why produce in and of itself is more expensive has to do with a bill called the Farm Bill. And that began in World War II. There was a push for more corn and more soy, one, to bulk out the rations that were given to the troops, and then additionally to be used for alternative sources of energy. So during that time, many subsidies were given to farmers to incentivize them to produce corn and soy. However, at the end of the war, that became less necessary. And so you had people and corporations that had begun to profit from those subsidies and fought very hard to keep them in place, to the extent that today we still have tremendous subsidies on corn and soy. And we also have an incentive for people to create large amounts of those products. This has created an artificial imbalance where there's, a hand on the scale, and corn, soy, dairy products are artificially lower, less expensive than they should be. And produce, therefore, is higher in comparison. So we don't have really an equal playing field. And this leads to the fact that the vast majority of very inexpensive foods tend to be those that are heavily bulked with corn and soy, including soy protein. And you find that your purchasing power is decreased when you are trying to really incorporate a lot of fresh or flash frozen produce into your diet. So this creates disparity, right? There's already economic disparity at play, even when we just look at getting and purchasing food. Another aspect is the way in which we make recommendations within the medical community. And I count dietitians, nutritionists within that field, because we typically are educated in the Western medical system. The studies upon which we base our recommendations for things like diabetes, hypertension, scales of health that are based off BMI, which is already a pretty outdated measure, all of those studies historically have been only with white subjects, white participants, and usually middle or upper middle class white participants. So all of our recommendations, our entire structure of how we view medical issues is through this lens. And we increasingly have researchers and academics and clinicians who are primarily people of color who are finding that stress and trauma, in particular racial stress, from operating in America in a non-white body, manifests very clearly in the body. And that causes and contributes to health and mortality. The other piece that we can look at is in terms of the sort of wellness brand. The fact that many wellness recommendations or fad diets are geared towards, one, being oftentimes prohibitively expensive, and are also typically reflective of attaining a beauty ideal that is primarily white European. A lot of our studies on psychology, and certainly on disordered eating, tend to be based on white, upper, and middle class women. So we perpetuate a stigma that the only people who might have their eating affected, right, in any significant way are white, upper, middle class women, which leads people to not, again, receive the help that they need. And if they go to visit a clinician who's in the health and wellness space, they may not be receiving culturally competent and sensitized information. So we're not looking at the ways that stress and trauma contribute to psychology and to the psychology of food. So when you look in a rounded sphere at the ways that nutrition interacts with race and politics, you see that it absolutely is affected. And I think what we have found and what we are discussing right now in this moment is that you cannot separate the racial history of this country from everything else. It's intimately linked. And we are all a part of it. We are all complicit in this process. So if we want to start to undo some of these biases that are inherent to the system, we need to identify what they are. We need to believe that they are real. I think if this is something that you're interested in and want to understand further, it's important to continue to read and investigate. Again, this is a super brief overview. It is not by any stretch of the imagination complete or as nuanced a conversation as it really should be. Additionally, if there are pieces of information that I have missed or are incomplete in my understanding, please let me know. I too am continually learning. So, to that end, I hope this has opened your eyes a little bit, I hope. And I hope that you are able to go back out with a more complete understanding that nothing is left out of this process and this struggle. So, thank you. Have a good day. Be safe.